A year ago, I took the plunge and finally purchased something I'd dreamed of owning for several years. A Framemeister, of course. Don't question my priorities, okay? They're perfectly in check. It's a high-quality video upscaler that's not only improved the production quality for all of my videos, but also totally revitalized my retro gaming experience. Since I made a video on it at the time, which you should check out if you haven't already, I thought it'd be good to follow that up with a second, more experienced perspective, as well as take you on the journey through some of my ups and downs with the device in regards to my personal setup, and touch on some future plans. Now, for those of you who may not know, one does not simply buy a Framemeister. It's a lifestyle, and one that requires a lot more upgrades to get the most bang for your buck. I went over this briefly in the previous video, but in short, majority of my game systems needed all new SCART cables to access their fullest potential. It might be a year later, but I'm still as stunned as ever just seeing how amazing some of these games can look. Initially, I was simply swapping cables out whenever I needed a different system, which isn't ideal as it can cause wear and tear on the connections. It's also just a messy hassle. So, I quickly invested in a SCART switch box known as the Bandridge. It has 5 inputs, which is the perfect amount for me right now, and in the event I need an extra set, I can always pick up a second switch box and daisy chain them together for an extra 4 inputs, but so far, it's done me well. This particular device does require a simple modification internally to avoid certain power issues, and since I fixed it, I've had no problems. Component switches, on the other hand, are a lot more commonplace, which just means you're more likely to run into cheap, poorly made products. I picked up this generic switcher online as it seemed middle of the range price-wise and had good reviews, and at first I had no issues with it. At some point though, the 3 other inputs just flat out stopped working, so I don't know what happened there. I haven't even bothered trying to find a replacement yet, which means I'm back to switching out cables. It's not too bad as I almost always want my PlayStation 2, but if I need something else, it's not that much of an issue to simply swap them over. Now, while this setup is not currently all together, I'll do my best to explain how everything here is connected, since I'm often asked how everything works. Number 1 rule: everything ultimately has to hit the AverMedia Live Gamer Portable, the capture card I use to record gameplay. So let's start off easy and work our way backwards. The Xbox 360, PlayStation 4, computer screen, and Framemeister output go through a switcher directly into the LGP via HDMI. The PS3 goes through a splitter first to bypass the copyright protection over HDMI, then into the HDMI input on the Framemeister. I'll talk about why this is important a little later on. Moving on to component with the PS2, PSP, Wii, and Xbox, as I mentioned, they're currently swapped out as needed, until I can find a new good quality switcher that hopefully doesn't break the bank. And while the Framemeister doesn't do as good of a job with 480 content on these systems, I kinda need it to go through here for game capture over HDMI. And like I mentioned last time, it's definitely an upgrade over my traditional methods of capturing these systems. Next is RGB over SCART. This includes the PS1, Mega Drive, PAL Region GameCube, Super Nintendo, and now Rgb Modded Nes. I finally got around to sending my Nintendo off to be modded for RGB output, and let me say, the difference is astounding. Here you can see what it looked like captured on my original setup with a low quality easy cap into my computer. Then we have it going into the Framemeister via Composite, and finally with the RGB mod. I mean, just look at the difference here. Everything is so clean and crisp. I wasn't expecting it to make this much of a difference, but I'm totally stoked with the result. I've actually been having trouble removing myself from it, as it's just totally revitalized my love for these games. systems. I should mention that also over SCART, I've got access to Master System titles with the Powerbase Mini adapter. It saves a lot of room in the setup, and now I get the chance to experience the other side of the 8-bit systems. I haven't had a whole lot of time to beat many of the games, but I really look forward to seeing more of what that system had to offer. And with the GameCube, I've also got the Game Boy Player for all of the compatible handheld systems. Since the previous episode, I've got my hands on an alternative to the official software Nintendo featured on the elusive Game Boy Player disc. By purchasing an SD media launcher with Action Replay disc to boot, I've got access to a homebrew program known as the Gameboy Interface. Long story short, it does a much better job of accurately displaying handheld games as they were intended on the big screen. And it's cheaper than the official boot disc, so what a win. Again, this has totally transformed my experience with these games, and I've used it a lot over the past year. I can't recommend that upgrade enough, whether you've got a Framemeister or not. It really looks so much better. Next on the list is the Nintendo 64 rocking that S-video connection. Despite picking up the highest rated cable I could find, I still get issues with this checkerboarding effect. From what I understand, PAL Region S-video on the N64 isn't quite up to scratch next to what you can achieve with NTSC. I might consider an RGB mod for the system in the future, but right now, I just kind of go about things as I need them with this system. It's a shame, honestly, and with all the upgrades elsewhere, this system may have possibly been downgraded to my most neglected system. I just don't really like how it looks, and no matter how far I try to tweak settings with the Framemeister, it doesn't help much, unfortunately. And finally, we've got the Atari 2600. This outputs RF over a brand new cable for nice crisp quality. Or as good as you can get by these standards anyway. That goes into the VCR, where the signal is then output via Composite, and then into the front of the Framemeister. It's a complicated setup that's taken quite a lot of tweaking, and honestly, there is still more to be done with it, but so far, I've just been enjoying each new game I try out across all of my different systems. Except for the N64. Oof. Now that we've covered how all this works, I think it's worth getting into some of the challenges and trouble I've faced since installing all this new equipment over the past year. Possibly the biggest thing I haven't been able to figure out yet is getting games displayed on both my main TV via the Framemeister, but also my CRT. This is important for a number of reasons. A direct connection without processing can be helpful in some cases, but mostly, a CRT is required for playing any kind of gun games. Now this TV only has two inputs, Composite and RF, and honestly, Composite looks fine on here in my opinion. So the easiest method would be to split the signal off at some point down the line, going to both the Framemeister and the TV. But we're not really using these cables anymore, so rather than go out and purchase even more gear to get this sorted, I have tried a couple things first with equipment I already have access to. The first thing I tried was one of these cheap HDMI to Composite adapters. I've already got a HDMI splitter, so at the end of the line after the Framemeister, I split the HDMI in two, one going to the TV and capture card, and the other to this converter before it finally hit the CRT. Unfortunately, the CRT didn't seem to like it. I'm not sure why that is, and I'm not ruling out that this method could work, but when I tried it, I had no luck. After this, I was behind my TV cleaning one day when I noticed that this TV actually has a video output over Composite. That means you can duplicate your display to a second screen, which sounds like it would work. But the thing is, the TV needs to be displaying a Composite input to output the same signal, which defeats the purpose of even having the Framemeister, and even still, it didn't work correctly anyway. HDMI is a digital format while Composite is analog, and without the proper conversion, they're incompatible. That would also explain my issues with the chip converter not working. So I think the only way for this to work would be to split these different analog signals off before they reach the Framemeister, and then send them to the TV. So I'll be looking to do that sometime soon. I feel like peripherals, light guns in particular, are an integral aspect to the gaming experience. Now, hopefully you might be starting to understand that, like I said at the top, there really is no aspect of this that is just a simple upgrade. It's a new lifestyle, put simply. One that might seem tedious to some, but I really do enjoy tinkering with all this stuff. Part of my routine before I start any game is checking to make sure everything looks correct before recording a full playthrough, simply because I want things to look good. I keep archives of everything I play, so ideally, I'd like them to stand the test of time as best as possible. I've spent a lot of time tweaking the settings of every system and saving a whole bunch of custom profiles. Then, with a solid default in place, it takes less time to further tweak things on a game-by-game basis. The process is mostly straightforward, and I've followed a lot of other people's guides, which have helped me to get my defaults set up, but they've also sent me in the wrong direction a few times. Being from a PAL region has made things a bit more confusing, as PAL games generally display a bit smushed on screen compared to NTSC, due to the extra lines of pixels being displayed. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is one that's given me a big headache, for example. Here is how the game looks directly connected to the CRT. As you can see, it's quite letterboxed and almost looks like 16 by 9. But the problem this causes is certain shapes look incorrect. Circles are more like oval shapes, and squares aren't perfect squares. Now, it is true with CRTs that pixels aren't always perfectly square, but this is far out of line. Circles and squares are the shapes I look for when tweaking settings, but what should I do in this case? Do I try to scale the image correctly how it's displayed on an actual CRT for my region? Or do I stretch the PAL graphics out of whack to meet the spec of an NTSC display? It can be confusing to set things up, as you can see, but while I honestly love how this game looks full screen like this, I'll admit it's inaccurate. In retrospect, I should have stretched it to make sure shapes are displayed correctly. Aspect ratios have given me a lot of trouble. Some systems like the Mega Drive or Genesis if you'd prefer, and the PlayStation 1, don't actually display a perfect 4:3 aspect ratio. They're actually slightly wider, and it's the reason displaying Crash Bandicoot at 4:3, like so many people do, results in crates appearing too skinny. This is the reason my PS3 goes through the Framemeister before it's captured, as certain games like Silent Hill, Rival Schools, and Destruction Derby Raw can cause issues with the Framemeister due to frequent changes in resolution the device struggles with. These games need to be played on a PS3, so what I've done is make a PS1 on PS3 profile to try and correct the aspect ratio, as well as get colour and other settings as close to what an actual PS1 display looks like. Other times, I find that certain games don't use up the full display in an effort to save on resources within the game. This is a common technique, but again, it can lead to an awkward journey to get it scaled correctly. Aside from the resolution switches being a big problem for the Framemeister, its second biggest weakness, in my opinion, is the process of rescaling the image. In theory, for a game that could potentially be zoomed in a little, using the zoom function would be a simple fix, but unfortunately, that's not the case. The image will be zoomed in within the aspect ratio, causing the sides to get cut off. So in these cases, the various zoom options need to be combined with the options under the visual set menu in order to widen the cutoff so that the image can be scaled up correctly. It's a tricky combination that requires time and patience, as altering one setting can affect another. In these extreme cases, I will generally take a screenshot from the original zoomed out default, assuming the aspect ratio is already correct with my custom default settings. I can then scale and tweak as needed, continuously comparing the image to my original until it matches. Like I said, it is tedious, but worth it in the end, as I'd rather the vertical space be completely filled out. During this process, I also check to make sure things are centered on screen correctly and evenly. Now, to be clear, that is an extreme example, and quite often, it doesn't get anywhere near as complicated as that. But when it does, going through a lengthy correction process like that, I will find flaws with my default settings, which is a good thing, as it allows me to correct them for the future. That entire process would probably put a lot of people off, but to be honest, it's only an important step if you're planning to capture gameplay, as you want it looking the best it possibly can be. I gotta say, I really love seeing games that are normally displayed quite small, blown up to take full advantage of the screen real estate. I just wish that the Framemeister allowed for zooming the entire image simply, rather than all of this messing around with the aspect ratio. Finally, I'd like to mention probably my worst, most recent experience I've had with the Framemeister. While live streaming late in 2018, the video signal cut out and wouldn't return. I was using the Gameboy player over SCART, and while I could still get audio, there was no video signal. At first, I assumed it had simply overheated. My capture card was sitting on top at the time and was incredibly hot, so that made sense. The next day I woke up, tried it, and managed to boot up a game over SCART without any issues. A few days later, however, I returned to find that I couldn't get any video over the SCART connection. All of the other inputs worked fine, component, HDMI, S-Video and Composite, but for whatever reason, the SCART connection just didn't work. The light on my switch box told me that it was receiving a signal, but even bypassing that part of the setup entirely still didn't help. To even get SCART into the Framemeister, it first has to go through a SCART to 8-pin adapter. So because of this, I come to two conclusions. Either the adapter has failed, or something with the device internally has failed. Now the latter would be extremely catastrophic, as shipping it off to be repaired or replaced would kill production on all content for this channel. It was still within warranty, which would mean a free replacement if it couldn't be fixed, but nothing would replace the time I'd lose if that was the problem. Luckily, however, I was able to get in contact with Rob of Retro Gaming Cables UK. This is where I bought all of my new SCART cables when I upgraded the entire setup. Not a sponsor by any means, and Rob didn't need to help, but he did, and I really appreciate it. What a top bloke. He sent me a replacement SCART to 8-pin adapter, which solved the issue, just in time to get started on video production for the new year. So I'm not sure what specifically got fried or how it got fried. My only explanation would have to be some kind of power surge or something along those lines. It's not really my area, so I don't know for sure, but I'll know if it does happen again in the future where to start troubleshooting. But for now, everything is back up and running as normal. Thank God. Actually no, thank Rob. Cheers, mate, you saved the fucking channel. My favourite systems to play alongside the Framemeister easily have to be the PlayStation 1 and Super Nintendo. Both are primarily 240p systems, which is the device's strongest point, and with the SNES, I think the 16-bit graphic style just suits it perfectly. As for the PS1, that was my system growing up, so it's really like growing up all over again, seeing some of my favourite games looking just so good. I'm also incredibly happy with the Game Boy player now that I've got access to the Gameboy Interface. I love seeing how these games look, and just getting to play them on the big screen is a huge win for me. I've never really been big on portable systems, so getting to experience and treat them like real games, I guess, has given me a new appreciation for all of these systems. And finally, like I've already mentioned, the NES with RGB output is easily my new obsession. I just can't get enough of how all of these games look. Now, I talked briefly about my game archives earlier, but I shouldn't downplay. That has been a huge undertaking for me the past year. Since I've always stored full playthroughs of games for ease of access, all of these many days worth of footage needed to be updated with the Framemeister. I've done my best over the past year to recapture as much as possible, and I'm nowhere near done yet. But out of just over 100 full archived playthroughs, I've recaptured almost 30%, which may not seem like a lot, but that's alongside also playing through a heap of games I've never played previously, for videos or otherwise. While I've mostly focused on the most important playthroughs so far, I'm hoping this year to get through some of the other games I may not talk about as much, but still need redoing. I've made this a big part of live streams here on the channel, as it's a good excuse to turn an otherwise time-consuming job into a fun one, and people seem to enjoy watching as I play through a lot of these games. One of the biggest series I'm yet to recapture though is the Jak and Daxter series, because I've noticed something strange. As I've mentioned previously, 480 content is generally considered a weak point for the device, though I personally think it looks fine. While not perfect, the Framemeister does a very decent job at de-interlacing interlaced video content. This is when you can sort of see the individual lines that make up the full image. Well, for some reason, I've noticed that with the Jak and Daxter games specifically, despite trying a large variety of different settings, the Framemeister completely fails to de-interlace correctly when any flashing is on screen. You can see here, instead of flashing, we just get these interlaced lines, which look terrible. I'm not sure why that is, but I've discovered that switching over to the Framemeister's Bob de-interlacing mode, known as Game 2, solves the issue for the most part. It's a strange quirk I haven't fully figured out yet, and the Jak and Daxter games are the only games where I've had this issue. Though Bob de-interlacing does seem to fix this particular issue, unfortunately, this method causes a bobbing effect with the graphics that I'm not overly keen on. It's far less noticeable in motion, but it does muddy up the image overall. I suppose at least the issue can be resolved, but I just figured I'd mention this as a demonstration of some of the difficulties that can arise while trying to get the highest quality possible out of these retro systems. So with that, I'd like to give my opinion on if you should consider purchasing one of these devices for yourself. I've had a lot of questions about it, and quite honestly, I don't think it's necessary at all. It's a luxury item that does a superb job as a piece of professional equipment. As someone who makes content, it's more important to me than a functional camera, being that I'm in the gaming scene. If I wasn't making videos, I wouldn't even go near the thing, to be perfectly clear. I'd say you have to be pretty hardcore to go down this deep rabbit hole if your only interest is playing games. People are often scared away by the price tag, but what a lot of people don't seem to understand is that that is just the initial price tag. You can very easily double the cost by simply upgrading to the correct equipment required to even access the high quality a Framemeister can produce. This is why I look at this device as a professional piece of equipment, not something you buy as a quick and easy solution to getting high quality video out of your retro systems. So please, really consider and try to understand what it is you're actually getting into if you're considering a purchase for yourself. It's great and I love it, but I can also justify and consider it as a business expense given it's required for me to do my job. Which brings me to talking about the future, what I'm aiming to achieve with the Framemeister and this setup as a whole. Like I said earlier, I'll be looking to get the CRT set up for light gun games. That's number one right now, along with a new component switcher. The NES RGB mod was the big thing I wanted to get done, and now that it's sorted, I'll be pretty set for a while. I'll keep thinking on the Nintendo 64 mod, but we'll just have to wait and see with that one. Now in the past year, I've also added an original Xbox to the setup, finally. It's modded specifically so I can play the North American exclusive Tony Hawk game, but that'll make it easier to pick up games for in the future. Thanks to Brandon, I've also got Master System access with the Powerbase Mini, and just recently, I picked up a PlayStation Portable. I've wanted one of these since I was 10, and now I've finally got one. Which means no more emulators for this system, which is something I'm really happy about, as I love the authentic experience. But probably the biggest addition I need to make to this authentic game capture setup is a Nintendo DS. Now, any help with this would be really awesome. I need a way to capture direct gameplay from an original Nintendo DS with the Game Boy Advance slot. That GBA slot is important for some of my future plans. The one answer to this problem I keep hearing about is the loopy capture card mod, but I'm not sure if there are any alternatives. It's an expensive mod for a system I haven't traditionally covered a whole lot, though I would like to. But with my mission to be completely independent of emulators, playing and capturing games direct from the original source, I need an original Nintendo DS capture solution which still allows usage for the GBA slot. So, if anyone is knowledgeable on that, please let me know if loopy is the way to go, or of any alternative options for getting the highest capture quality possible. I'd love to learn more, so I look forward to hearing from you. But that about does it, people, so to close this off, this device has transformed the way I play and enjoy games. However, it should take very serious consideration if you're considering taking the plunge and picking one up for yourself. Now, if you have any further questions or comments on anything I've said, please let me know down below, follow with liking, subscribing and sharing the video. I'm Square Eye Jak and I hope you have a great fucking day. Thanks for watching.